Today we're going to be looking at Unit 5, Notes Number 3, U.S. Reaction. So we're finally going to be focusing on how the U.S. is responding to all of these events in Europe. The United States responds cautiously. Most Americans were alarmed by the international conflicts of the mid 1930s, but believed that the U.S. should not get involved. So, a lot of Americans still held on to their isolationist beliefs after World War I that America should focus on America, and if events did not directly involve us, then we should stay out of them. In an effort to keep the U.S. out of future wars, beginning in 1935, Congress passed a series of Neutrality Acts. The first two acts outlawed arms sales or loans to nations at war, and the third act was passed in response to the fighting in Spain. So these are directly related to things that are happening in Europe. Congress can see the aggression with Germany and Italy and Spain, and they're trying to keep the US out of everything. They don't even want us selling to nations at war. They want us to be completely out of the conflict and be completely neutral. President Roosevelt found it impossible to remain neutral. In 1937, FDR spoke out against isolationism. He called on peace loving nations to quarantine or isolate aggressor nations in order to stop the spread of war. So he's seen the bigger the bigger picture in that it's almost impossible for us to stay out of this conflict. It will involve us at some point. This quarantine speech by Roosevelt showed that he was ready to take a stand against aggression. So let's stop and think. Why does the United States initially want to remain neutral? So again, many people are still kind of shell shocked from World War One. They don't feel that the conflict that's going on in Europe involves us, and they really just want America to focus on America. They don't really see the need for us to be drawn into these European conflicts that will just cost us money, have to send our military over, potentially lose lives of Americans, and they want us to, let Europe deal with their own problems. But there is a sense of that what affects them does affect us. So you begin to see people having different perspectives. But as the events are happening in Europe, and again, this is 1935, 1937, war has not begun yet. It's still easy for people to want to be naive and want to remain neutral. The Axis threat. 2 days after Hitler invaded Poland, President Roosevelt spoke reassuringly to Americans about the outbreak of war in Europe, trying to calm fears that this did not affect us. In September 1939, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to pass a cash and carry provision that allowed warring nations to buy U.S. arms as long as they paid cash and transported them in their own ship. So what this does is it forces we want to help out certain countries. It's going to be obvious which side we want to help out. And we want to give them supplies, not give them, but sell them supplies, but we don't want to go in debt. So they need to pay for it up front, and then we don't want to risk our ships transporting it. So they need to come and pick up the goods and transport it themselves. By providing arms, FDR argued this would help out France and Britain defeat Hitler and keep the US out of the war. By the summer of 1940, FDR was providing the British with all aid short of war. So we want to do everything we can. We're going to give them supplies, we're selling them guns and tanks and planes, everything they need, because we want them. The best scenario here is that Britain can win the war, he can defeat Hitler and the Nazis, and then we don't have to get involved. On September 27, 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed a mutual defense treaty known as the Axis Powers. Their goal was to keep the US out of the war and come to the defense of others in case of an attack. Nazi victories in 1940 convinced Congress to boost defense spending and initiate the first peacetime military draft. So at this point, World War I has officially begun. We are not involved in the war yet, but you can see Congress is starting to get prepared. We need to get our defense spending up. We have a draft. We're starting to train an army because we want to be ready, just in case. The Great Arsenal of Democracy. FDR warned that if Britain fell, the Axis powers would be left unchallenged to conquer the world. To prevent this, the US had to help defeat the Axis threat by becoming the Great Arsenal of Democracy. By 1940, Britain had no more cash to spend. So does that mean we're going to stop selling them weapons? No, no, no. FDR suggested a new plan called the Lend-Lease policy. Under this plan, arms and other supplies would be on loan. So when you lend something to somebody, the intention is you get it back. And so he comes up with this policy so that we can still supply Britain with the supplies that they need. But ultimately, are we getting this stuff back? No, but it's a creative way to still supply our allies and still again hope that they can defeat Hitler on their own. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941. Isolationists argued against the plan because, again, we're getting more and more involved in the war, but most Americans favored it. Britain was not the only nation to receive Lend-Lease aid. By this point, Hitler had gone back on his non-aggression pact, and he had invaded the Soviet Union. So we began to provide aid to Stalin and the Soviet Union. So now, even though we don't agree with Stalin, his politics, the way he runs his country, his enemy is Hitler. Our enemy is Hitler. So the enemy of my enemy is now my friend. The Atlantic Charter. President Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met secretly at a summit aboard the battleship, the USS Augusta. Churchill hoped for a military commitment from FDR. He settled for a joint declaration of war aims called the Atlantic Charter. So Churchill at this point wanted the U.S. to enter the war. They were just waiting for it, but not the time yet, according to Roosevelt. Both countries pledged collective security, disarmament, self-determination, economic cooperation, and freedom of the seas. And this declaration was signed by 26 other nations collectively, known as the Allies. Basically, all these countries are agreeing to be against Nazis, the Axis powers, and against Hitler. The attack on Pearl Harbor. The U.S. military had broken Japan's secret communication codes and learned that Japan was preparing for an attack on the U.S. On December 7th, 1941, early in the morning, the Japanese attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on Hawaii. For an hour and a half, the Japanese planes were barely disturbed by the U.S. anti-aircraft guns and blasted target after target. The attack was over by 9:30 a.m., but the devastation was appalling. The Japanese had killed 2,403 Americans and wounded another 1,178. 21 ships were damaged or sunk in the attack. Reaction to Pearl Harbor. The next day, on December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed Congress and made a request for a declaration of war against Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war against the U.S. Many who had been former isolationists now supported an all-out American effort. Because we were directly attacked, we now feel that the conflict was brought to us, and so pretty much every American is now on board to support the war effort. And so the U.S. was now officially involved in World War II. How did the attack on Pearl Harbor change American opinions about the war? Hello?